Okay. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the kind of second edition of the HP series webinar, making video analysis work for you. My name's Kyle Smith. I'm pretty excited to be here. Got kind of called up to the HP squad for this one. It's exciting. It's like I don't know, like an 800 distance runner getting called into the 4x4. I'm ready to go. I'm so excited. Anyways, just want to go through this real quick. I'm pretty excited. We've got Dana Way here. He's our AC sports science lead, biomechanist on our staff. So he'll go in a little more detail on this. So what it'll look like today is that we'll have a slideshow going through a presentation of kind of what to, the whole encompassing thing of the basics of making this work for you and kind of some practical applications. And then we'll leave some time at the end to do some Q&As. So just a couple things. You're all muted on this. If you have any questions throughout, just put it in the Q&A box. We'll get to it at the very end. I'm hoping to get to everyone, so we'll see how this goes. We're here for an hour. And at the end, anyone who put in their NCCP number, you'll get a point for this one. And at the end, you'll be able to find this on the AC YouTube channel. So yeah, I'm gonna stop my screen. And Dana, do you want to introduce a little bit more, kind of what you do specifically with AC?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, so like Kyle said, my name's Dana, biomechanist and sports science lead with Athletics Canada. I think I've been doing this almost just over 20 years now, um, focusing mostly on the applied side. So a lot of my mentors are coaches and not necessarily the sports science side. So I generally lean towards the performance, and so hopefully this will kind of go in stride with that. Um,
It's gonna be good. I'm
yeah,
excited.
yeah, nice. As Kyle said, it's so making video analysis work for you is the title. Before we go into it, I kind of want to. I'll start with maybe a story, and I always like to start with the mistakes that I made early in my career, and it kind of changed and shaped how I look at analysis to begin with. So, I um, I was working with combined events coach and an athlete, and we were at a camp, and it was shot put day. So I was young, pretty early in my career, and the coach was actually extremely experienced, very high profile, high level coach at the time. Sure, most of you probably could imagine who that would be. And so I was very, like I said, I was very young, and I really thought my job at the time was to just collect video, document it, and kind of be the video guy, video person. Um, so this day in particular, I set up my camera, hit record, stood back, and every time they threw, I just hit record and it recorded it. As the athletes threw, I was just kind of watching, passively observing, sort of reacting to it a little bit, saying, "Oh, that was pretty good," and kind of letting myself not really focus on any of it. Basically, I just thought I was there recording, right? So I let that session just kind of wash over me. In the middle of it, though, the coach came over to me and said, "What did you see? What do you think of that last one? I didn't see it. How did that one go? Um, why wasn't it why was it shorter than the last one?" And I had no clue. I absolutely froze because I wasn't paying attention. I was just hitting record and I was just watching it. And I thought maybe I could get that information later, and I couldn't because the video wasn't very good either. It was just I just hit was just hitting record, right? And so I couldn't answer him in that moment, and I was really just sort of reacting to the flow of the moment and not really paying attention, and wasn't looking for anything specific. I really hadn't tuned my eye or the camera to what was actually needed, and so I think it was kind of at that point where I realized that, watching and just recording is very passive, and it just kind of confirms what's happening and what isn't happening. Whereas when we think about seeing something, it really requires that focus on the movement or the specific question kind of that you have in mind. And so I think it was that kind of moment that I moved from just taking video and being the video guy to actually doing analysis. And sort of hopefully that's kind of where we end up going today.
Oh, that's a good
So
story. I
yeah,
like that.
so I will share that out and hopefully learn people can maybe learn a bit from my mistakes here. So I think are we have a screen
Yep.
that's
This
shared?
looks
So
great. Yeah.
awesome, perfect. Okay. So yeah, the slide here I think is just, again, it's a summary of the story that I kind of just told of being, watching is the kind of the passive and seeing is the active. And I think now sometimes we refer to that and what is the noise and what is the signal. And so, sometimes watching is just the noise and being focused in and looking for clear objectives is the signal. And I think generally as coaches, you know that. But I also know that coaches have a lot of things going on, right? Like you have multiple athletes running or jumping or doing all these things. You have the competition trying to pay attention to all these things to juggle. So just being aware of what's watching and what's seeing. When we think about video too, we can utilize video to be the seer, right? So we can set that camera up to focus on the clear objective and make sure that the video is seeing and not just watching, because that's what happened in my scenario is I was watching, the video was watching, and no one was actually seeing what was happening. And so today, I think the webinar, in my mind, is really how do we get the most from this video? And it's not, I don't want to go into analyzing specific movements or event specific. That's hopefully down the road, more webinars. I think the bicarb one had the Nomeo outtake of the another webinar. Hopefully this kind of continues on and we can get into more specific analysis. That's probably again for another day. Today is more just around the workflow of how to get what you need from the video. And so what I've seen sort of over the past, 15, 20 years is that coaches, athletes, sports scientists, we want more data, we want more information, but we have to have the basics to get there. And so hopefully this kind of workflow gets us on the right track. In terms of where we go, I started with the purpose, okay? And the purpose is really about starting with a question, not the camera. So instead of just setting up the camera, hitting record, and going through the motions, we have to know what the purpose of that session is or what we are trying to answer. So generally, we start with the question, then we can start to define what is needed to answer that question. Okay, so I'll run through a bit of that. Essentially, this slide is all about the asking. So what are we actually trying to answer? And before we set anything up, we have to have a good idea of what we're looking for. Again, as coaches, you're coaching. That's what you do. You coach technique, you coach the event, so you know what you're looking for. Let's try and set that up with a camera so that we can specifically hone in on some of these things. And so as you can see, I kind of have three different columns. And each one of these are kind of a bucket of what we're trying to answer. The first one being kinematics. And it's really about describing movement kind of quantitatively. So these are the things where we measure, we have long-term tracking. We can really look at sort of what are the angles, what are the time, what is the velocity. That's what kinematics essentially is these quantitative descriptive movements or measurements, as opposed to kinetics, which are more forces, completely different topic. But the kinematics are, again, sort of what are the shin angles? What is the flight time versus ground contact time? What are release angles, heights? Those are things that we can actually measure. And then the second column, we have technique. That's really more around evaluating movement. So when we think about this, we often think about the intercomparison. So if we look at an athlete that is doing, either at the beginning of the session compared to the end of the session in fresh or fatigue, or beginning of the season, end of the season. So you're comparing one athlete to themselves, and that's really sort of the intercomparison. That's obviously something that coaches do all the time. And then we have the intercomparison, where comparing an athlete to another athlete, kind of the copy the champion type of technique method. And then the third kind of question or example in that technique was, are they hitting key position at whatever? So you have a set of parameters that you're kind of looking at qualitatively and descriptively of kind of, you think of some of the coaching manuals and these things of, the golden positions or, when at foot contact, are the knees together? During these different positions are the arms and where they're supposed to be based off these other models. So these are technique and really evaluating the movements. And then the third column is performance. Performance questions are really about explaining the outcome of something. And so, again, we have the examples in the corner of why is the clearance inconsistent. So, if a high jumper is going and it's like they're making and then they're not making, why is that happening? Right? So that's the question. And then similar to why is velocity being lost in translation? So, oh, the athlete looks like they have a good acceleration, but then when they get to top end, it doesn't really seem to translate where they seem to be losing velocity in the transition. Or, why is the implement always in the left sector? And so it's important to note that these are not steps that we follow sequentially. They're just buckets. Okay. So they're useful in framing what type of question we're looking for or what type of question we're asking. Um, but we can go back and forth between them. And so some days you might start with that performance problem. And so when you think about coaching is, maybe you do start with why are they so inconsistent? Why can't they get over the bar consistently? Or why is that implement always going to the left? Then you go back to the technique and say, okay, let's compare them from this rep to this rep. Was there a difference? Because this one went straight down the sector compared to this one who was left in the sector. So now you start to evaluate the technique a little bit, and then you start to say, well, what are the pieces of that technique that I could measure and track over time to do that? So that's one way you can go performance to kinematics. You can also go kinematic to the other way and say, you know, according to a bunch of the literature, a bunch of the manuals, that these are the flight times, or these are the shin angles, or these are the exit angle out of the block that I want to achieve. And so I measure that. And then you start to go, okay, well, you compare it intercomparison, or you compare it to someone who does it really well. And you look at that evaluating movement in the technique column and say, this looks different, right? And then you go and say, oh, that worked or it didn't work on the performance question. So you can move throughout these. They don't have to be one way or the other. These are just understanding where your question sort of fits in and how we go about either evaluating it or measuring it or setting it up. And I think the key to this is that your analysis really improves when you know where your question sits. Okay. So as a biomechanist, maybe to get a little bit sciencey, but I think a lot of coaches kind of use this type of thinking as well as using deterministic models. Some of you may have seen it, maybe some of you use it. I think a lot of you as coaches use this, just in your head. You may not draw it out like this, but as scientists, I don't even like the term scientist. I sound weird when I say I'm a scientist, but when we do this we create this is essentially just a roadmap to performance or a family tree of performance. And we start with a result and then we break it down into the factors that produce it, right? So if we look at something on the left-hand side where you have 100 meters, so your result is the time, and time is made up of how fast you're going and how far it is. So, well, the distance is always the same, so there's no factors. We don't really need to worry about that. We look at the speed component. Speed is, essentially length and the frequency. So what are the pieces of frequency that we can look at? And we go back to ground contact time and flight time. And those are our kinematic questions that we asked previously. We can make this as complicated and convoluted as we want in some of the right-hand side, or we can make it simple. Again, it's just really knowing what you're trying to look for. Um, Another example would be in shot put, right? If shot put distance is essentially comes down to three factors. You have your release velocity, your release angle, and your release height. Okay, those are your three things in your projectile motion. Obviously, a lot of factors affect those, but those are the three main pieces. If I know what I want to capture, so I really want to look today at the angle seems to be off. So, okay, well, we're going to focus only on the angle. I'm not really filming the throw. I'm filming a certain subset of that throw. So I'm going to focus only on the hand and release angle. Or I know that the angle um, or I have a thought that maybe the angle is low because of the way that they're doing it, the way that they're coming in from entry, right? So, or then now you start to frame these questions of what am I actually trying to do? And then those really make up sort of how you start to do your analyses. And one of the things I mentioned in the questions is around, is it qualitative and quantitative? So I may have said quantitative sort of in the kinematic side. So quantitative really comes down to, again, like it suggests, is quantities, measures, and validation of the coach's eye, which oftentimes we think of quality. The qualitative movements are really descriptive movements. We think of that as that's how you coach. Those are your cueing, those are your things. Trail leg needs to come up higher, or get your foot down, whatever, or you're starting to notice these different movements. That's the coach's eye. And the coach's eye is really qualitative, but it is enhanced. And so I don't want to say that quantitative is better than qualitative. It's just different. And so understanding the difference between them is also really important. So qualitative can be extremely descriptive, and one example that I use all the time is to say, oh, there's a man walking across the street. But you can really say there's a man who has dark brown hair, who has blue jeans on, walks with a limp, and is walking on the left-hand side of the street. And you can get really descriptive, right? And those are good things. Um, but then we can also go into the quantitative side, and that's when you start to track things long term. And coaches' eye are extremely good for the cues and the coaching piece and larger pieces. One thing that we do know is that recall and actual measurement and identification of things can somewhat be poor. And so that's why we have to have some quantitative measures and setting those things up so that we actually validate what we have, and that actually makes your coach's eye a lot better. And so with this, we also have what I like to call kind of seeing the full picture. And these are three different ways that we go about doing that. Um, I'm sure at some point along the way, you've all heard about planes and axes. If not, I apologize. I'm going to kind of skim through some of it. Essentially, what it is understanding that people move in different planes of motion, and understanding them is critical in where we set up sort of the camera and where we sort of analyze from. I think, as coaches, you probably all learned that you need to be able to coach and see the movement from all different views. It's the same thing when you're setting up a camera. You need to be able to think what are the important parts, and what are the motions that an athlete is going through, and how do I sort of measure the things, and where do I need to set those pieces up. Uh, Phases of movement, again, it's that's a I'm pretty sure everyone has seen sort of the kinegram concept, where you sort of break down. That's essentially what phases of movement means. We're isolating specific phases of a complex movement. So as humans, we like to take larger things, and we do a really good job when we break it down into smaller chunks, right? If we think of, we all memorize our credit card number, and I'm not going to say mine here, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we almost create rhythm or harmony or smaller chunks so that we can digest it. It's really good when we do that with movement as well. So naturally, I think in technical events, we think of there's different phases of it. There's run-ups, there's penultimates, there's plants, and in the throws, there's different pieces as well. So we naturally kind of do that so that we can help. What we can do is when if we think of the kinegram concept, or the chronophotography or whatever, we're taking small bits of information so that we can then measure it and then have a reference point to it as well. And then the last one I alluded to before as well was the intra and inter comparison. So being able to understand when you need to compare your athlete to themselves, and when you need to compare an athlete to either another athlete or to a known performance benchmark. And so it is good to know when to sort of move back and forth between those. And so athletes, when you're comparing it always to themselves, you may miss out on what you're actually trying to achieve. So, you continue to the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? So if you're just continuously looking at your own athlete, you may not get what you actually need. On the flip side of that, if you try and compare it to someone who your athlete is nothing like, or maybe you're actually looking at the wrong part of that. There's a famous sort of story in biomechanics that is like this athlete grew up idolizing this other legendary athlete, copied their technique, got to the Olympics or World Championships or whatever it was, and said, "Hey, everything I have achieved is because I copied what you did, and specifically this one piece." And the athlete looks and says, "I've been trying to get rid of that move for my entire life." Right? And so, in that scenario, obviously they made it happy and nice and it worked out, but you know, you can't just copy what other people are doing because it may not be the right thing to do. So to put some real life context into this, you can see in the top left, the planes and axes. So we all have understanding where movements occur in space is very important, not only for coaching, but also for setting up video. And so we all generally have biases, or sometimes we don't have a choice. As a coach, sometimes you're just standing in the middle of the field because there's a lot of things going on, and you can only watch from that angle, right? So, or sometimes I tend to look at things in the sagittal plane, which is the side plane, because a lot more things seem to happen there. Sometimes I forget that there's pieces around on the other sides, either above, and so you think about rotational throws, a lot of that stuff happens in the transverse plane, in a rotational plane from above. So if we have views of that, that can help if we're looking at things like hip and shoulder separation. And so if we use a specific example here with this athlete, on the side view, you can say, oh, you know what? Things look pretty good, and not to say that from the back view they don't, but they look different. So you can see that, trunk lean is a little bit to the right, the left arm is a little bit out to the side. You may not notice that from the side view, right? So having this perspective and understanding where people are in space, and this really helps because when you're a coach, you may not always be in that position, right? You may be in a position that's just slightly off. So if you can orient yourself in space and understand where people are moving, that's super helpful, or where you can set up a camera to get information that you need. And again, the bottom two, the phases of movement, the kinegram style. Again, I'm pretty sure most people have seen sort of a sequence photo. You can do that pretty easily, just either screenshotting or with other software. You don't even have to have it in this style, but it's just again coming down to what are the pieces. And I also think that it's important that it can be user defined. And so, when we think of traditionally, even in just in running, we have we may think of touchdown, mid stance, toe off, max vertical projection, the strike. Those are the pieces that have kind of been said that those are important, but there may be other pieces that are important to you as a coach or you with that individual specific athlete that are a problem. So breaking down that piece is also important. Um, One thing to note with the intra and inter comparison is that when you are comparing either within an athlete or with a different athlete, is to make sure that the views are the same. So you can kind of see those views are all from the same angle. And so when we try and compare, we don't want to have, a view that's, I mean, if I go completely off the rails and say one from the front and one from the side, you're not really going to be able to get that information. Okay. So once we know the question, then we start recording. And this really is sort of the foundation of where reliable video analysis um, comes from. So I think that I have the note there that consistent setup produces consistent results. And so this is a really important piece is when we're setting up a camera, we're setting up something to record, that we have consistent pieces that we can either reproduce so that we can then utilize the same information over and over and over again. As a checklist, I would say that this is sort of just a quick snapshot of like what you need to know. And the main thing in all of this is know your device. So we all have different devices. We all have cameras in our pockets now. Every phone pretty much has a camera. I know maybe unless some of you are maybe on flip phones, I hope not, but maybe some of you are. That coach that I that I was working with still probably has a flip phone. But the main thing in this is know your device. And so I use an iPhone, some people use an Android. I also use cameras or camcorders, whatever it is, know how to do what you need to do on it. And that really comes down to one of the things that I do is I set up some shortcuts on my phone as well. So I can just kind of click a button and up comes the camera with the settings that I need, as opposed to, if I go and I hit record and it was like, oh, all the settings and everything I did was for my, daughter's Christmas concert the other day. Everything is blurry, everything is dark, or I have cinematic mode to make it look nice, or I have princess filters, things like that. It doesn't, make sure we have things set up so that we're not fumbling around. With that, you also need to know the limitations of your phone. So I'm not going to obviously go through the manuals of each phone, but knowing that and getting used to what your phone can and cannot do is important. The first piece that I have is all about placement. And so I have tripod as a major piece, not always a necessity, but it is very important in my mind because what can happen is as a coach, you get caught in that watching versus seeing and setting up the camera on the tripod, that can be the seeing portion of it, where you just set it up, you can get that piece that you want to look at and just record it, right? Now you may say, well, what if I have to pan because it's a race? Well, that's a whole other question that we're going to talk about is what's important. Do you want to see the race or do you want to focus in on one piece of that race? Okay. So it's just starting to ask those questions again. Being perpendicular to the plane of movement really comes down to, if your athlete is running this way and I want to see the side view, I'm not off to the side or one way or the other. I'm directly perpendicular to that movement. So if I want to see knee lift and I want to look at or dorsiflexion, I'm perpendicular to that plane of movement. So it may sound a little odd too, but if the athlete is running in that direction, and I want to get a back view, that may not be, doesn't seem like it's perpendicular because they're moving away. But if we think about the plane of movement, I want to look at tilt of the trunk, or I want to look at hip drop. That's in a frontal plane, so I'm perpendicular to that plane of movement. Okay. So we have to understand that, again, it's not the direction of movements, it's perpendicular to the plane of where people are moving in space.
And what you're looking for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And what you're looking for. And
Yeah.
sometimes that might not be, sagittal or frontal because we are multiplanar.
Hmm.
So one example, and we'll see it on probably on the next slide, is in high jump, there's a curved path, right? So you can't always be here. So I may not be perpendicular to the bar because when they're coming in, they're on an angle of where I want to. So I may be looking at penultimate, but I may look like I'm off to an angle, but I'm perpendicular to what I'm trying to see. Yeah. And so we have also like consistency in distance and how far we are. So lenses are also curved, so they create an arc. So we want to make sure that things happen in the middle of a frame. If we start, I know a lot of times when we have GoPros or things like that, we're like, oh, we can get this really wide angle and we can look at it. But as things move out and go further away, we get what's called parallax. And so everything seems to, it basically creates an angle of what we're looking at. So the lens is widened, and so it almost creates as if we were just pointed kind of that direction to it. So it allows us to see things, but not so good, excuse me, for measuring anything. So we get the decreased um, accuracy in that. When we move farther away too, and we want to get more strides in, sometimes we lose that resolution. So if we try and zoom in, the athlete may only be this big. We zoom in, they're completely pixelated. So we have to think about what is important. One of the things that I do at if I'm going to competitions, say if it's a technical event, I make sure I have my spot. I make note of where I am. I kind of look, I kind of zoom in, and even when I zoom in, I make note of the zoom factor that I'm at. So if I come back for another session or I have to go and do something else, I go and I'm like, okay, that was the zoom that I was at. I was standing in this exact spot, that kind of thing. So we're trying to decrease and mitigate some of the errors. Um, And then also when we're in the stands. So when we're up higher in the stands, we're looking down. So that creates an angle and that creates a skewed perspective. So you may not be able to get angles of things, but it's also being high up is also good if we're just looking for split times. So if we're in a race in multiple time, we may not want to go, if you're doing a 1500 or something, you're not always looking at the technique of every run. You're just looking what are the times and so or different strategies. So again, it comes down to asking and knowing what you're trying to look for because we'll go up to the top just to make sure that you can see track markings and then you can start getting split times off different marks and things like that. And that goes to, we think about starters. You want to make sure you have the gun and you can see the smoke, right? To get an accurate split time. If they have a light gun, sometimes that's not always the case. You may not be able to see the light. One of the things that you can do is you can actually go to the finish line and be in line with the finish line. And when they cross the line, you can actually do your timing backwards, right? So we know the time that they finished, but we're in line with the finish line. So we have an accurate representation of when they finished as opposed to when they started. Um, the second part is around settings of your camera. And so I think some of these pieces in here are people kind of maybe get confused in terms of I know certainly on an iPhone we have what's called slow motion on an iPhone, right? Where it's just slow motion. It's not really slow motion. It's actually a really high frame rate played back at a normal frame rate. Okay, so in older cameras, what happens? So it's actually at 240 frames per second, say. I think that my example is 240 frames per second. So what happens is it's collecting information at a rapid rate, 240 frames per second. Why it's slow motion is because it's played back at either 30 or 60 frames per second, right? So it's either at a factor of 8 or 4, so it's 1/4 speed or 1/8 speed. That's why it's shown in slow motion. If it was played back at the 240 frames per second, it would be normal speed, right? And so this is kind of where working with coaches, it's like, oh, they don't want to do uh, slow motion because it takes away from that coaching eye, and you want to be able to see the rhythm of the movement, and I completely get that because that's how you normally coach. You don't always have video, and so you see things in that real time. And also when you see things in slow motion, you go, "Oh, that was real bad," or you're just not used to it. Um, so, I mean, if you have a way to do it, sometimes we will speed up the video 4 times or 8 times, and that creates real time. Um, the point around this is that when you just record in sort of real time on a camera in 30 or 60 frames per second, you're not getting a lot of information. You're only getting 30 or 60 frames per second. Whereas we could get 8 or 4 times more information, which is very valuable when we're trying to do timing things like ground contact, or even just looking at when the foot hits the ground, right? Or when something occurs. If you're looking at the release of an implement, if you're only having 60 frames per second versus 240 frames per second, you can get that exact instant. And so um, I kind of, play around and say, what is the sweet spot for you, and what is knowing what your camera is capable of? We have cameras that are capable currently that are at 1,000 that we use, but the quality then drops. So, it's the way they get their speed is by reducing the resolution. So then it's almost unusable. So it's really about playing around. Again, going back to the very first part of this of what are you trying to achieve and what do you need to know. Second part of this is the shutter speed. And this is probably the most common one where people um, tend to not mess up, but this is one piece in here where it's like we tend to get a lot of bad video, myself included, is forgetting about the fact that there's shutter speed. And so it is worth noting that a lot of times in the native app on an iPhone that there is no real way to manually change that I don't think yet. I think you have to kind of go through third-party apps. So there's things like Blackmagic or Filmic that are manual cameras. Probably not needed. I think iPhone now has like sport mode, So it kind of creates sort of better image stabilization, but it also, I think, jumps up the shutter speed. And what shutter speed essentially is like if you think of an old camera, that shutter opened and light was flooded in to expose the film to whatever was out here. So when it was a long shutter speed, um, you know, it's in fractions of a second, 1/500th, 1/2000th, etc. So if it was low, like 1/100th of a second, it's open for this amount of time. Lots of things are happening, and it gets jumbled up on the film, right? Because of the light. Similar concept on the sensors and cameras. Little bit different mechanism and stuff, but the concept is the same. It's we need to be able to have a quick snapshot. So when the shutter opens, you get a nice clean image on there. Okay. One of the things is like a lot of the apps that are out there now. Again, we use OnForm quite often. So I think if coaches have had athletes that are on Olympic or World Championship team, they would certainly know that we use OnForm or what that is. And I'm sure a lot of coaches probably have used it. But it actually has a camera system in it. And I think sometimes it gets passed over because it's like, oh, I already have my camera. I just use the camera app. But in apps and specifically in OnForm, you can actually change the shutter speed to get, I think it's like a turtle and a rabbit kind of thing. So it's pretty laid out, pretty simple. It's like, is it a fast motion or a slow motion? And so you can kind of get that information to be able to actually go through and have the manual settings. The last part of this one is really around framing the shot, and I made the comment about panning and stationary. And anyone who's ever, I think, worked with me has heard me say this exact comment is, what would you like from me? And they're like, oh, just get pan the whole thing. They're doing a 60. Okay, what are you focusing on? Oh, just the whole 60. I want to see the 60. Okay, but are you trying to is it the first couple steps that you're really working on, or is it the transition, or is it the top end? Oh yeah, it's like the transition. Okay, so then you move to that spot, right? And so but they want to pan. So it's important to know that stationary is always better for measurement, but you can get um, information from panning. You just have to know where you're going to stand. So, what is the point when you are going to be perpendicular to that movement that you want to see? So, that's why I generally ask that. If you're focusing on transition, okay, well, I'm going to be at an angle for the acceleration, and then they're going to pan and they're going to be right in where I want them to be for transition, and I can make measurements there, and then they move out of frame. And you still get to see qualitatively maybe what's happening, but quantitatively, we need to focus in on what this actual is. Um, and that's similar to what the whole movement versus tight focus. And this is where having a camera can be, or an assistant or biomech or somebody else to be, you can be the person that sees the whole bigger picture and watches the whole movement. And you can have the camera tighten up on, is it just feet, right? Is it, you want to specifically look at ground contact time on the first three steps? Zoom in on that and focus on that, right? And a lot of times we get caught up of we want to see the whole movement, but sometimes we have to focus in on what we're actually trying to do. So again, like I mentioned, the shutter speed part, this is you can't analyze what you can't see. So when we have a low shutter speed, this is what happens. We tend to get that motion blur. And when we have a high shutter speed, we tend to get focused information. And so light does have an effect on that. So when you are indoors, you may not be able to get a high shutter speed. But one of the questions that you have to ask is, do you want dark video and clean movements or bright video and blurry movements? If you can't see the athlete at all, well, then clean movements don't really help. Maybe we just want to have, we get what we get. And so this is an example where this was me at, I think that's the 2012 games where I was probably rushing around and just grabbed the camera. I was probably filming something else that didn't require a high shutter speed. It was just split times in a race, came back, didn't have my settings set up properly. And it's not completely unusable, but if we were to go back and compare to that athlete to when they were in training camp and say, well, this is what they looked like in training camp versus this is what they looked like in competition, it's kind of hard to see where that back foot is, right? You have a good idea, but if you really wanted to look at this and you're talking about the Olympic Games, you probably want to be pretty sure.
Yeah, and
Oh,
there's your
sorry.
angles and everything too, different.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And this is
Yeah,
where the angle piece and talking about being perpendicular, um, is it's so important to be in the right spot. And so again, as coaches, you want to pan, you want to do these things, you want to get the whole movement because you think you have to get everything, and you really don't. You think about the amount of practices there are and the amount of competitions there are in a year. You can spend some time to focus on the one or two things that you want to focus on and that matter. And so this is a perfect example of being perpendicular to an athlete and then being not. And you could say, oh yeah, that athlete, looks, yeah, that angle's actually probably close to 90 degrees. Not too bad. And then you say, oh, on the right hand side, yeah, it's probably pretty close to 90 degrees too. That's what we're looking for. But then when we actually go and measure it, we go, oh, first off, that wasn't 90 degrees. It's actually way less than 90 degrees. Didn't realize that. And then you go on the other view and you're off and you're like, wow, that's a 7 degree difference, right? And so it's really important that we're getting in the right positions and knowing where we are and what part of that trial you're actually trying to focus on. So hard to get quality information from bad angles, and this is why stationary will almost always beat out the pan when you're doing measurements. Now, one cheater method that you can always do, and I'll do this because I understand that you can't always do the perfect setups, is that when you are perpendicular, that's obviously your standard um, place to be. That's where you're going to get your good information. If I'm looking to my left, and the athlete is going, so in this scenario, you have the athlete coming across you this way, you can see that that angle is bigger, right? So that that view creates that skewed image where every angle that you view from kind of here will probably be a little bit bigger. And as that athlete passes through the other way, it'll probably be a lot smaller. Okay, so just know that when you think, oh, that looks like it's about 90 degrees. Okay, or I mean, in this case, it isn't, but I know that this piece is 80 degrees. If I back it up, it was probably a little bit wider. So perpendicular view, if I'm looking at it one way, it's going to be bigger. If I'm looking at it the other way, it's going to be a little bit smaller. And then just a quick note on when you actually do measurements, and again, I think this is probably more suited for an advanced analysis and getting into advanced specific stuff, which would be really good, is when we actually do measurements, um, it is important to set up a calibration. And so some may or may not do this, or have maybe seen me do it, is I set up cones in the lane and I set them up sort of at 1 meter and then 2 meters. And so I can calibrate that in a software that we can talk about later. But it is important to note that if you are doing calibrations, that it has to be in the same plane as the athlete. And what I mean by that is if I moved those cones um, into lane 6 or whatever it is over here, and the athlete's running in lane 3, and I calibrate to those cones, it's not going to be accurate at all because it has to be in that same plane because their depth view gets skewed in video. And same on the right. I have the circle here at 2.135 meters, and if I were to like set something up over in this back corner, like a measuring stick that we tend to use, it would be a little bit off. So you have to be able to know that those measurements are not going to be accurate. So calibration has to be done correctly, sort of as well. So we kind of asked the question, set up the camera. Now we have to get that information to the athlete. And this to me is really about the difference between having kind of cool clips on your iPad and actually changing performance. And so taking sort of the raw video to that evidence-based feedback portion. This is a system that is, I mean, it looks probably similar to anyone who's ever seen a scientific method or anything like that. Or some of you go, oh, that just makes sense to me. This is exactly what coaches do and what I think sports scientists do on a daily basis. This is how we put it all together. Um, this is really just evidence-based feedback. So we observe what's happening. This is the question. This is the protocol. This is going back to the very beginning of what are we looking for? What are we trying to achieve? And then how do we go about doing it? So the protocol, setting it all up. Then we go into the analysis portion, and that's really sort of applying that purpose. So what was the, applying what we were the answering the question that we originally started with, and how do we sort of get that best information? A lot of this has to do with looking at specific sort of KPIs or going back into those deterministic models. Again, I would love to go down this road of, event specific things and how do we actually analyze these things. Um, Again, another day, hopefully. And then the next part of that is evaluating it. And so one of the things I think that's important to note is that data without context is extremely dangerous. And so if we have we start to measure stuff, but, so if I measure and say, oh, that angle is 140 degrees, is that good or is that bad? We don't know, right? So you have to be able to compare it to things that we do know. And that's where you get into your intra-comparison or your intercomparison or your long-term information. So we know that, you know, the classic idea of say 90 and 120 in the blocks in the set position. Those are known variables, may not be what is needed in that specific scenario, but we do know that, so we can compare it. So we have some context to it. Then we go into that feedback portion. This is a really key part of this is, you know, I think the way that I operate, I don't generally work directly with athletes. I work with coaches. And so this is going to be highly specific to your athlete. And do you want them to be part of that analysis? Do you want them to look at the video? I'm asking them, how did you feel about it? What did you see? Do you see a difference? And I think that can help sort of create kinesthetic awareness in them. Sometimes if you have athletes that are really overanalyzers, it may be not a good time to do that. So maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you limit that back. Or maybe, you know, if we look at the portions of the season, when are the good portions to do that? So, you have your off season where you go into breakdown. This is the, heavy portion of when we do analysis. We start to look at the quantitative part, bigger changes. You go into the preseason and start to say, okay, you start to do a bit more intra comparisons. You build off those and then you work in season. And so in season becomes more sort of around high frequency qualitative pieces. And again, important to note that the qualitative pieces are not just, they're built off of the quantitative pieces. So you've got that information, you've built that out. You have data that you've tracked, and now it becomes the qualitative portion becomes cues and becomes monitoring throughout this. And then in the competition phase, I have, what's called the high stakes adjustment. And really, that comes down to, are you making a change or not, right? And, you have to be confident that that change is validated by all the things that you've done. Okay. In terms of tools, I think there's really two tools for this. You have what is in-field, which is your mobile apps, and then your in-depth stuff that you would do at home, and that's your desktop software. I'm not going to go through all of these pieces because I think there's probably on the App Store, there's probably one popping up every day now. Certainly with machine learning, computer vision, AI, everybody has an app for that now. We tend to use, like I said, at Athletics Canada, we use OnForm. Uh, the reason we use it is I think it just serves our purpose pretty good for now. It does a really good job of the qualitative piece and the sharing piece. It has good quantitative pieces to it as well. So you can measure angles, you can measure distances, times, things like that. You obviously have to pay for it, which is a bit of a weakness. But if you're, I think if you're a CAP athlete and you're on the national teams, things like that, you as an athlete come under our umbrella. And so you would get it for free in terms of an athlete profile. Coaches, we would generally bring that you in as an athlete as well. So your tools are limited, but you get access to that in there as well. So if you're continuing to work, with me on the biomechanics side, you still have an advantage of being able to use that as well. Uh, in terms of the desktop software, a lot of people, I don't know how many have been around for when I first started. Dartfish was kind of the thing. Still around as far as I know, but there's a free version that is amazing, and it's called Canovia. And the downside is that it's only on Windows. So if you have a Mac, you kind of have to play around and boot up through Windows, but it's free and they continue to update it. It's a group of individuals that are very science minded, but also sport minded. And it has excellent qualitative and quantitative tools. When I talked about the calibration piece, that's really one of their strengths is you can calibrate to any individual camera. So you can put in the specs. Um, there's pieces that blow my mind that I don't do because it's too far out of my stuff. But if you put in the model and the lens and the refractory pieces of all the lenses, you can get really high accurate information. I don't do that, but it's one of those things that it can do for a free software is pretty impressive. Um, and then I also have the Beyond video. And the reason I have that in there is one of the pieces that this webinar is focusing on, like I said at the beginning, is that we want more information and we want to have there's IMUs, there's GPSs, there's all types of wearable sensors, there's heart rate monitors that we can get information from. But as I said before, I think it's extremely valuable to have context to all of these things. So just getting information is not good enough. You need to understand the movement of that athlete. And I know as coaches, you do, but having that video can then either validate it or continue to track it long term. And so, again, one of the examples I use is you can have all the force or speed data you want, but if you don't understand how the athlete is putting that force into the ground and what those angles are, from the video or from something else, it's extremely hard to use that or make change going forward. And the last piece on this for me is really I have this slide called perfection is the enemy of good. And so I understand as coaches, there's always a trade-off. And so even as a biomechanist in the field, there's always a trade-off. We're always in the stadium, we're always, at places that are non or suboptimal. And so my goal is always to have the most reliable data that you can capture in the context you have. Okay, so if anything, that's, one piece of this is I went through and said you have to do all of these steps, but you also have to understand the limitations of the situation that you are in. And so if you're in a large group and you're coaching a lot of athletes, a 5 minute qualitative check in season is better than sitting down and not being able to do anything at all, right? And so that's when you go back and you look in the off season to say, what are the key pieces or measurables that I can do throughout the year where 5 minute qualitative checks are good. And so high speed cameras, 3D motion, awesome. They're precise, but a lot of times you just have a phone. And so setting yourself up for success and working through those, creating consistent, reliable protocols can give you good results in the context that you have. And that's really it.
Okay, this was good. I like this. I mean, you blew through a lot of the questions I had, but that's good because it covered a lot of the stuff that I wanted. I mean, I'll be honest, I wanted to have my cell phone out when you were talking about like shutter speeds. It's like, okay, let's just see. I wanted to ask you right then and there what parts, but
Yeah, which
maybe
part
that's
on
a
here? Yeah.
yeah, maybe it's another webinar idea. You could do like a how to.
Again,
That'd be
we're
like a
creating more work for
I
ourselves.
know
We got to keep
that's
our
it.
jobs.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, so we got some mindful of timing for everybody.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so I guess my first question, I'm gonna get you to almost like Cole's note it for our new coaches that are like, new to using video analysis. You talked about um, figuring out the why, like what are we trying to figure out? But like, what's a Cole's note version of like getting started the right way with using this?
Yeah. Again, it comes down to asking the right question. What are you looking for? Then you can start doing the pieces that you want to do, right? So, getting any video, I think is probably the best start, just collecting video, but we want to enhance that, and that
Hmm.
comes down to, understanding that you're not going to be able to get everything all the time. So pick something that you are think is a really important part, KPI
Hmm.
or phase throughout that, and focus on that and try it out and know your device to be able to capture that.
Okay. And so we got this video. Like, what do you have advice to like? Do you? working with the athlete with this? Is this something that me as just the coach needs, or like what do I want to do with the athlete with this stuff?
Yeah, I think we live in this world where, again, 15 years ago to 20 years ago, it was like we had access to like the internet and we had this, but it was very slow. Now we live in this world where everything is in our pocket. We can do
Yeah.
this. It can be an extremely powerful tool, but as great power comes great responsibility for any comic book fans out there. And so I think you can allow those as a coach, if part of your philosophy is having that athlete be involved in this, it is a big process, and it certainly works on the remote side. I think we were talking about it as well as having, you know, extended breaks, or sometimes you can coach athletes further away. I also live in Winnipeg, and so I'm not in a hub or DTE with anybody. That the ability to have that directly working with an athlete can be beneficial. And I think
And
as an athlete, it also helps you sort of like I said, mentioned, I kind of alluded to it as create some kinesthetic awareness. So
mhm,
being able to see, but also have the cues. So it's one thing to just send them the video. In a lot of the apps, and specifically even in OnFarm, you can put overlays and you can have audio overlays. So you can remote coach and have them listen to you and view it. So now you're getting coaching cues plus the video as opposed to just video.
so it's like homework for the athlete as well. They can actually,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
remotely, they can now sit back afterwards
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
work with that. Okay. Okay. That's a really cool feature. Someone had asked a question specifically about it, so about
Okay.
with it. Where do you know about on form videos and you can send it over to Canova?
Yeah, so then one of the nice pieces with OnForm is that
Canova, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
Canova. Yeah, yeah. One of the nice pieces and one of the reasons that we actually chose OnForm is that you can pull everything downloaded, right? So a lot of in the past, a lot of the apps that we have used have gone under.
Hmm.
So, things come and go. And so choosing the right one is important. But how you know that, you don't know. So in OnForm, one of the features that's kind of nice is you can pull that video directly off onto your
Hmm.
computer. And then I do it all the time because the Windows app for OnForm is not very good. And so sometimes you can put it on your computer, download it right on. Sometimes you have to sort of, if you have an iPhone, you can download it to your phone and then pull it off the cloud onto your Mac. So there are steps involved in it, but
Hmm.
you can get it to there fairly easily.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good to know. Do you have you used drones? You talked a little bit about overhead angles. One of the questions Coach Scott asked was uh was about drone usage. It said he'd
Yeah.
found it useful for high jump and shot and disc. I was just curious, have you tried it?
Yeah, we've thought about using it. We don't use it a lot,
Yeah.
mostly because like if I go to a camp or something, we drones are so regulated in so many different places that it's really hard to do that.
Yeah.
But I do know like in the DTEs and even when drones first came out, we were using that type of thing. Certainly in the circles, but we've actually moved away from that. Obviously being in Canada indoors, drones can be kind of tough indoors. So
Yeah.
building we have
Uh,
an overhead camera rig where it's just
Oh.
basically made out of PVC pipe that you can get at Home Depot and strap a GoPro up there and take it down. So you can do pretty high quality video stuff with cheap materials.
And you'd keep it consistent every time if you
Yeah,
just get the stable spot every single
yeah,
time. Yeah.
exactly.
Um, so what if I have a big group? Like this is great, I can film, but I've got this massive group. Do you have any recommendations or what you would suggest with large groups?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I sort of alluded to it, and I maybe probably dismissed a bit of it of like, you know, doing something is better than
Yeah,
nothing.
yes.
But yeah, I think in terms of filming stuff, it comes down to, um, maybe one day you have to film one person over the other or whatever. And so, I mean, I guess even one way that we would do it. So one way they do it at camps, if you're, I'm gonna probably cherry picking a bit of an easier one, but if you're doing starts, and you have a camera on the inside, you can really only see the athlete that's closest to you. Next trial, if they're doing three starts, you ask them to rotate the
Mhm.
blocks, right? So
Oh
then
yeah.
you can get at least one trial of each athlete. If you're doing multiple laps of an athlete, if you have the endurance athletes, setting up that stationary camera
Hmm.
and it sucks, but if you just hit record and let that baby roll, you have to do editing later on, but you can then kind of capture, potentially people going through. And that's really comes down to letting the camera be that person that kind of sees the things that you may not be able to see.
Well, that's good. So yeah, I like that. So you could let it roll, do the edits after. So that
Yeah.
kind of feeds into my next question is, what about the storage of all this? I've got all this video now
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
high quality video, high frame rate. What do you suggest to do with storage? Are you a cloud person? Are you a massive storage units? Like what would you
I
suggest?
I am an ongoing struggle with this myself type of person. Again, one of the nice things with say on farm is it's all cloud storage. It's on there.
Hmm.
I personally don't like that all the time because again, what happens if it goes under? So
Hmm.
I create redundancies along the way on a lot of things. So you're talking to a guy that has I have hard drive after hard drive after hard drive just sitting around and saying, we have all of these pieces. I use the cloud because it's easy
Yep.
for a lot of things to be able to recall that on my phone. I use my phone and iPads a lot. I probably have all video on iCloud and 3, 4 different hard drives. The good news is space is cheap now for hard drives. Back when it first started, it was extremely expensive. So,
That's a good
um,
point.
but the other point in this too is yeah, like there is, knowing what like high quality stuff takes up a lot of space. And so, if you're trying to transfer video back and forth very quickly, again, what are the important pieces of this? So if I'm just collecting information on a 1500, I don't need 240, 480 frames per second. Probably just need 60 frames a second to do lap timing. And I could probably drop that down to 720
Mhm.
frames per second or 720 resolution. So I'm
Mhm.
just collecting that, right?
You-
But if it's a short burst of things, I can then ramp up all these pieces, the resolution, the frame rate. And so you can kind of play with those things
mhm.
to if you have space constraints.
Space, yeah. Um, Okay, conscious of time, there's one final audience
Okay,
question.
yeah.
We've kind of like answered a lot of our ones, which was great. This is, going through it all. Um, so Dana had asked, does analysis software help you pick the points? I can imagine the variations in how you pick the angle might make angular differences. So do you find that using it helps you with that? Like, does it give you guiding ones?
Like in terms of, sorry, can you read that again? I'm trying
Yeah,
to.
does analysis software help you pick points?
Okay, so like picking points on the body, maybe.
So yeah, for the angle, so how it like thinking about
Right.
the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
ankle,
Yeah.
angular differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what I'm gonna do? I will share this screen again just really quickly. I think is my screen back up there?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
We're on questions right
Yeah,
now.
I'm gonna back it up into here.
That's
Yeah.
the one. Yeah.
So analysis software, some of them will, right? So now with AI, we can, there's a million gate analysis apps that pop up and we
Mhm.
can throw up a wireframe on somebody and they'll just pick it. I don't think they're accurate enough for any really, really good quality information. I think it's good to say, oh, just look at these pictures but to get really good information, not really. So one thing that's actually very easy to do is if I'm looking at the knee joint here and I think of that knee joint as a hinge,
Mhm.
and we can sort of validate this by just moving the frame back and forth and seeing where the foot swings, right? And so I pick that point as my joint center, and then I just essentially move my line through the other joint center of where the hip moves through. So I think of a point on there where
Mhm.
that hip moves. Same with down through the shank on this side of where the ankle is. This one's an easy one because you have an ankle bone, you have the malleolus. Just draw a
You
line
can
straight through
you can
that. That
see it.
was that
Yeah.
was a pretty
Yeah.
easy one to do. Yeah. But you really just have to think of like how that arm movement moves or that
Mhm.
leg movement moves and pick that point. Again,
Okay.
if you're consistent through it, and you're doing it all the time, then it's good. If other people are doing it, then it
Yeah.
becomes a bit of a problem.
I feel like this is the desktop you'd want the desktop for this to really versus my big finger trying to
Yeah,
hit it
I
on
have a
my
hard
phone.
time doing big fingers on a
Yeah,
small phone or an
yeah,
iPad to get really good stuff. Yeah.
yeah. This was incredible. I appreciate you organizing this and bringing it to everyone. This is fantastic. This was very exciting to learn this. I learned a lot. I love that this is available on YouTube after because to go back and see the shutter speeds and to see how to manage
Mhm.
everything is going to be huge and kind of the setup points and looking for those kind of basic questions. Like I think these are great. Um,
Awesome. Yeah,
yeah,
no, and again, if anybody has questions about it, that's my
they
email up there. And yeah, I'm glad. I know it's not the most exciting piece of it, but again, I think it's the good baseline for hopefully where we can continue to go.
I think this is it. This is exactly what we talked about is here's this
Right.
baseline. Everyone now has this, and now you can kind of play with it because you
Yeah,
offered free versions, paid versions to kind of mess around with it, showing about your phone. Like this is great. Where the angles should be taken. I think this is because I those are things that I wouldn't have thought of initially of
uh,
I'm about here as opposed to no, I'm here for this race
right.
consistently and prelims finals this race or right or
Yeah.
rounds and just all that. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, awesome. Thanks.
So we have one more of these coming up next Thursday.
Correct.
Yeah, we got everything to do with plyos. So this is good. This is everything to do with it. Programming, progressions, same time same time, same place. December 18th, register for it. Yeah, it should be a good session.
Yeah, I'm looking
This will
forward
be,
to that. Okay.
and this is kind of rounding it out before kind of everybody slowly shuts it down for a bit.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again. Thank you
Yes.
everyone for being a part of this. And have a great night.
Thank you.